we will be looking at. So I hope you have your Bibles ready. I'll tell you where to turn in just a moment. But I want you to think tonight about situations and circumstances in your life. And let's be honest with ourselves and with the Lord tonight. You don't have to speak out loud, but just personalize this. How many tonight can think of a situation or a circumstance that you are facing in your life right now that in your mind seems impossible? It could be spiritual in nature. I think examples would be somebody for years that you have prayed that they would be saved, or just somebody that in our estimation, like there's no way they would trust Christ, in our thinking. And yeah, we know God wants them to be saved, but the situation, the circumstances look bleak. Maybe it is someone that is making choices in their life, and you can see choices that they're making, and you know where they're headed, and yet you don't know if they'll make the right choice. It could be a health situation. I know there's folks in our church that deal with health situations. Some we know of, some we don't know of. And medically speaking, humanly speaking, seems impossible. It could be a struggle with sin that you've had. Maybe a battle that you faced with sin for years, and really Satan has convinced you'll never see victory in that. I mean, it's just, in your estimation, it's impossible. Well, I want to look at a story tonight. I want to encourage you really tonight through a story in the Old Testament in 1 Kings. And I want you to go there with me if you would. Because often in these situations, and whatever it is for you, maybe something else came to mind, and it's not limited to those things, but in our human thinking and our reasoning, we don't get it, we don't understand, we can't figure it out. And yet, if we're honest, in many of those things, I think we limit God. We believe that God could do it. We know that he could. He's all powerful. He's Elohim, the creator God. He's almighty. And yet, in this situation, we're like, yeah, but if I were honest, I just don't see how he can do that. Well, I want to look at an example in the Old Testament, 1 Kings. I want you to start in chapter 18. We're going to focus in chapter 20, but in 1 Kings chapter number 18, you remember the story, and Elijah is here, and they're on Mount Carmel, and there's a challenge that takes place between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And we're not going to go over the whole story, but if you know God's word, and if you've been around the things of God, you remember the story. And there he is. The prophets of Baal do all these crazy things. They're crying out to their gods, and nothing's happening. And Elijah steps forward and really goes above and beyond to show the power of God. And he calls out to God, the God of heaven, and God rains down and consumes the sacrifice. And I mean, the prophets of Baal are like, wow. Now, is it one of those stories you would have liked to have been there to see happen? Of course. I mean, it's one of those miracles, and you're like, oh, that would have been so neat. So we could say that in chapter 18, Elijah is on the mountaintop, right? Don't we like mountaintops? The mountaintop experiences. This morning we looked at the pinnacle of praise. I mean, we like that. We like those experiences. And you get to chapter number 19, and now Elijah's at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, he's fearful for his life because of Jezebel, and he is just in a cave. He's hiding. And listen, do you know that the same God in 1 Kings 18 is the same God in 1 Kings 19? See, in Elijah's mind, God, oh, look what God did in chapter 18, and in chapter 19, it's woe is me. Don't we live there often? Well, God, you can do wonderful things, and I know you can do that, and you can heal, and you can save, but chapter 19, I just don't see how that's going to happen. And I want us to focus on chapter 20 tonight of 1 Kings, and I want to challenge you in your life, whatever that circumstance that you thought of tonight. Here's my challenge to you from 1 Kings chapter 20. Don't limit God. If you've been in Sunday school, I've so appreciated Brother Rob and what he's been sharing. But over the past couple weeks, have you been reminded that God is God and he can do as he pleases, whether you and I understand it or not? whether humanly speaking it makes sense to us. God's God, and we're not. He's infinite, we're finite, and so God can, and I believe that is pictured here. I think it goes right along with what Brother Rob challenged us with, but in 1 Kings chapter number 20, there's going to be another battle that takes place, and Israel is going to be involved in this battle, but there, in the mind of the Syrians, of the king of Syria and the Syrians, in their mind, which they've heard about or witnessed what happens in chapter number 18. So I want you to look at one verse. We're going to go back and work our way through, but start in verse number 23, because here's their thinking. And the servants of the king of Syria, that's Ben-Hadad, we'll talk about him in a moment, said unto him, their gods are gods of the hills. Therefore, they were stronger than we, but let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they. All right, so here's what they said. Hey, you get them on even ground, you get us on level playing field, and we'll show them who's boss. And sadly, Israel buys into this thinking. And so I want you to be challenged tonight with this. Whatever that circumstance is, don't limit God. Because God is God and he can do as he pleases. So notice, beginning in verse number 1, kind of what happens here. And Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his hosts together, and there were 32 kings with him. So we're going to learn just some basic facts about Ben-Hadad. He is the leader of an alliance of 32 kings. So he's got some support, not just Syria, but other kings and horses and chariots. And he went up and besieged Samaria and warred against it. And he sent messengers to Ahab, king of Israel, into the city and said to them, thus saith Ben-Hadad, thy silver and thy gold is mine, thy wives also and thy children, even the goodliest are mine. So Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, he's got this alliance of some 32 kings. There is approximately 130,000 fighting men that he has at his disposal, a very large army. They have actually gone up and seized Samaria, and they've shown that they can fight. They have chariots and horses. They've got the latest technologies of war. But there's some things that are interesting that stand out about Ben-Hadad, and I want you to notice a couple of them. Look at verse number 12. It came to pass when Ben-Hadad heard this message as he was drinking. So he was a drunk man. And there he is enjoying the pleasures of this life. If you go down to verse number 16, and they went out at noon, but Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the pavilions, he and the kings, the 32 kings that helped him. Sounds like an outstanding gentleman in society, does it not? All right, that's the guy. That's Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, in verses 1 through 3. I think focusing on verse number 3, not only was he a drunk man, he was a proud man. Now notice verse 3. Thy silver and thy gold is mine. This is what he relays to Ahab. Thy wives and also thy children, even the goodliest are mine. Now, you talk about pride, there's pride right there. What you have is mine. I'm going to come take it. You can't do anything about it. There's an old proverb that said this, let not the one who starts the fight boast prematurely. And he's already doing that. Verse 1 through 3, he's got backing. He's got the latest technologies of war, everything at his disposal, and he thinks he's all set. Well, let's look at the other character in the story, someone we know a little bit more about, King Ahab. And if you've read through Kings, you can read about King Ahab. What was his wife's name? Jezebel. All right, Jezebel. Have you noticed that in today's society, no one gets named that anymore? That's for obvious reasons. Jezebel, and he's involved in idolatry. We know that based upon what happens in chapter number 18 and also his history. He is one that supported those 400 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. He was behind that, and he hated Elijah. Absolutely hated the man. You know why? Because he was God's prophet. And Ahab wanted nothing to do with God. But I want you to notice the size of his army. Verse 15, then he numbered the young men of the princes of the provinces, and there were 232, and after them he numbered all the people, even all the children of Israel, being 7,000. All right, so Ben-Hadad has an army of approximately 130,000. Israel under Ahab has approximately 7,000. Now, I am not a betting man, but I can tell you this. If I were to go to Vegas, I would not vote on Ahab, right? Those would not be good odds. Those would be horrible odds. We could say 1,000 to 1 odds in the favor of Ben-Hadad, but notice, because of that, all right, Ahab is going to limit God. And he buys into this thinking, well, Ben-Hadad is big. Ben-Hadad has other kings that are with him. Ben-Hadad has this large army. And I don't stand a chance. Listen, we do the very same thing to God. And I want you to see how that shows itself in verse number 4. No, after he hears Ben-Hadad say, hey, Ahab, your gold's mine, your silver's mine. I'm coming after your wives and your children, and I'm going to take it all. And instead of going to God and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do in this situation? Lord, I don't know. I mean, I'm outnumbered. I'm outmanned. I'm out, in the military equipment they have. Notice what he does. And the king of Israel answered and said, my Lord, O king, according to thy saying, I am thine and all that I have. You talk about giving up way too easy. That's giving up way too easy. I mean, they haven't even gone to the battle. And Ahab says, I can't do anything. This is impossible. And so Ahab gives up and limits God. And I want to show you what happens, because this is what I want you to focus on tonight. And that's this. Ahab's going to learn a lesson in this fight. Don't limit God in any area of your life. Whether it's health-related, spiritually, financially, physically, don't limit God. And so 3 things I want you to notice in this story, beginning in verse number 23. And the servants of the king of Syria, that's where we started tonight, said unto him, their gods are gods of the hills, therefore they were stronger than we, but let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they. Number 1, don't ever forget this. God is not limited to a place. He was God on Mount Carmel, and he was God in the cave, and he is God here. But the enemy's assumption was, God only helps them when they're up on the mountain, because militarily that was the strategic place to have. And so because they had this advantage up there, that's the reason. That's the only reason that they could win. But here's the mistake they made. It wasn't just a military mistake. It was an assumption that they made, the enemy made, that was quite wrong. And we find it in that second phrase in verse 23. And the servants of the king of Syria said unto him, their gods are gods of the hills. Now, somebody look at your Bible and tell me what was wrong with that statement that they said. You can see it. It's in black and white. What was wrong with that statement? That's right. They put a small g instead of a big G. They just assumed they're small G-O-D-S. Hey, listen, they're no match for us. What they didn't realize was they're dealing with capital G-O-D, God. That was the wrong assumption. They got it all wrong with that small g. And folks, we do the very same thing. The world that we live in, it's so corrupt, and society is so bad, and it's impossible to live for God today. Really? You believe that? You believe God would leave us here to do something that is impossible without him? No. Oh, well, you just don't understand what I'm going through and what I'm facing right now. No, but I will tell you this. There is examples in Scripture of those that did believe God. Think about this in Job chapter number 1, beginning in verse number 6. Satan comes and Satan says to God, hey, you know what, Job there, the only reason Job serves you is because he's got a lot of money and he's got a lot of wealth and you've blessed him with a nice family. And God says, okay, you think that? I'll let you do some things to him. And we know what happens. He attacks him and takes his children, takes his health and all these things. And yet you get to the end of chapter number 1, when children have died, when friends have forsaken him, when in his mind, I don't know why all this is happening, and physically he is suffering like he never has before. And in all this, you know what Job does? He praises and worships God. You know why? Who was he? He says it over and over. He talks about it in the book. I mean, I came into this world naked. I'm going to leave naked. Anything I have comes from God. The conversation towards the end of the book there where God's talking to Job and Job's talking to God. The truth is, Job got it. We cannot limit God. I don't know why God did this. I don't know why God allowed this. And he didn't know the backstory that we know. And I think oftentimes we just assume God really doesn't understand what we're going through. The enemy made a wrong assumption in thinking that Israel just served this small other god just like their gods. Someone said this, the devil was going to put his tools up for sale. On the date of the sale, the tools were placed for public inspection, each being marked with its sale price. There were a treacherous lot of implements: hatred, envy, jealousy, doubt, lying, pride, and so on. Laid apart from the rest of the pile was a harmless-looking tool, well worn and priced very high. "What is the name of that tool?" asked one of the purchasers. "Oh," said the adversary, "that's discouragement." "Why have you priced it so high?" he asked. "Because it's more useful to me than the others. I can pry open and get inside a person's heart with that one when I cannot get near him with the other tools. Now, once I get inside, I can make him do what I choose. It's a badly worn tool because I use it on almost everyone, since few people know it belongs to me." Had the enemy not done that to Elijah in chapter number 19? The tool of discouragement. And I think what happens is when maybe we've prayed for that person for years and they've not trusted Christ, we get discouraged and we think, well, you know what, is that going to happen? We've prayed for revival for so long, and we've sought God for that, and we desired to see revival happen, and we think, well, it hasn't happened. Or we look forward to seeing victory in an area of our life, and we think because it hasn't happened, well, for some reason, God's forgotten about me. And so instead of continuing to trust God and obey God, we get discouraged, and we really throw in the towel. And I want to remind us today that here we are on a Sunday, and God's still God on Sunday, and he'll be God on Monday too. And whatever happens this week that we don't know about, God is still God. He's God when we're out shopping. He's God if we're lying in a hospital bed. He's God if we're raising children at home. He's God if we're out in the workplace. He's God if we're here in church. The same God on the mountain is the same God in the valley. And we don't need to limit him. But I want you to see, secondly, not only is God not limited to a place, they made the wrong assumption in verse 23 that God only helped them on the mountaintops, and if we got him in the valley, then he's ours. But I want you to see, secondly, we look at verse 13, God is not limited to a person. Notice verse 13, "And behold, there came a prophet unto Ahab, king of Israel, saying, Thus saith the Lord, hast thou seen all this great multitude? Behold, I will deliver into thine hand this day, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord." There's this announcement that's going to come to the prophet that is going to say, hey, I've got the victory. The victory has already been won. And as a matter of fact, in Romans 8, a passage that Rob covered just recently, did he not say, "Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us"? So the victory, the cry of victory is going to come, but here is the part that amazes us. Who is going to be the one that God's going to use to get the victory? Who is it? Go ahead, say it. Ahab. Have you ever read that and thought, are you kidding me? I mean, let's be real here. You're right. If I was God, I sure wouldn't choose him. I'm not choosing that guy. So here's a thought. And once again, this goes with what Brother Rob... could God use a dirty vessel? See, in our minds, the answer is no. That goes against what he's going to say here. God, in our minds, we think God can only use a clean vessel. Now, don't get me wrong. Should we be holy and clean? Absolutely. God said, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." But God is not limited to that. Think about just in this here, he's going to use an ungodly king, a Baal worshiper, a henpecked husband to get the victory. That's what Ahab was. He was a henpecked husband. I was reminded of this joke this last week. Did you hear about the two lions up in heaven? And there were two lines that were there up in heaven, and there was this line that had all kinds of men standing in it, and it was the henpecked husband line. And then there was another line, and that line was the master of their home. And there was one puny little guy standing there. And all these big, strong guys are looking over, and they're like, how did he do it? I mean, look at him. How did he do that? And so finally they get up the courage, and they say, we got to go ask him. So they walk over to the guy who's standing in the master of his home, and they say, hey, listen, we got to know, how did you do it? He said, how'd I do what? He said, how were you the master of your home? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. My wife told me to stand in this line. That was bad, wasn't it? I need to go to the couples retreat, okay? But that was Ahab. I mean, this henpecked husband, Jezebel for his wife. And yet notice in verse number 14, again, God chose to use him. He says there, the prophet comes, says, thus saith the Lord. That's the word from the Lord. Hast thou seen all this great multitude, 130,000 plus? Behold, I will deliver it into thine hand this day, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Now, in verse 15, excuse me, that's verse 13. In verse 14, and Ahab says, by whom? That's a good question, because Ahab's thinking, it ain't going to be me. There ain't no way. Ahab knows himself. By whom? And he said, thus saith the Lord, even by the young men of the princes of the provinces. Then he said, who shall order the battle? Who's going to be in charge of the battle? And you know what the prophet says? You are. Me? Me? Do you think your thought crossed his mind? God's going to use me to get the victory? That's exactly what's going to happen. You know why? God's not limited to a person. See, we, in our American mindset, here's what we think. Well, as long as the right person is president, things are going to be okay. Not necessarily. Well, if that person gets in power, things are going to be really bad. Do you know that for millennia, God has used wicked kings to accomplish his purposes? Why? Would we do it that way? Probably not. But I'm thankful that God's God, not me, because there'd be a lot of things I wouldn't do right. But God's not limited to a person. God chose to use him. Do you know that tonight God can choose to use you? You might look at your life and say, well, I don't know if God can use me. I don't know if I have the ability to do that. And too often we limit God. Well, I believe God wants me to do that, and I believe I should take that step of faith, and I know I should get out of my comfort zone and do that. But we limit God because we think, I just don't think I'm the right person. What if God says you're the right person? Nobody would have picked Ahab. I'm sure the prophet is like, Lord, are you sure? Are you sure you got this guy? You want me to give the message to this guy? Yeah. Tell him. He's the one. But there's another reminder in this, God's not limited to a person. Could I say this? Don't ever give up on anybody. Don't ever think that case is too hard. God will never save them. Did God use Ahab? Well, let's find out. Look at verse 29. He said he was going to. And there came a man of God, verse 29. I read verse 28. And they pitched one over against the other 7 days. And so it was that in the seventh day the battle was joined. And the children of Israel slew of the Syrians. Are you ready? How many Israelites were there that were counted? 7,000. All right, 7,000. Notice, seventh day, the children of Israel slew of the Syrians 100,000 footmen in 1 day. In 1 day. 7,000 defeated 100,000, but it didn't stop there. But the rest fled to Aphek unto the city, and there a wall fell upon 27,000 of the men that were left. I mean, it's like 2 days, 130,000 people gone. You know why? Because God's not limited to a person. Did God use Ahab? He absolutely did. Why? I don't know. Now, don't buy into the world's thinking, well, God can use and does use dirty vessels, so that means I can live the way that I want. No, wait. And God used Ahab, so therefore I can kind of live my life the way that I want. Oh, no. Friend, listen, in chapter 22, Ahab came to his demise because be not deceived, God is not mocked. And you remember the story. They're out there in the battle, and there's this archer just one day like, hey, what does this thing do? Whoo! And then, bam! And by the way, God prophesied that. Judgment on Ahab. In chapter 20, you're going to die. I'm going to bring you to utter destruction. But in this time, in this battle, God chose to use Ahab. Was Ahab worthy of that? No. Did Ahab deserve that? No. Would we have done it differently? Yes. But God's not limited to a place, and God's not limited to a person. And I want you to see thirdly and finally tonight, God's not limited by probability. God's not checking what the odds in Vegas are, whether something's going to happen. I want you to see how odd these odds were, I guess you could say. Look at verse 27. This is how it's described, and I love how descriptive this verse is. And the children of Israel were numbered and were all present and went against them, and the children of Israel pitched before them like two little flocks of kids. It's like these little goats. There's two little flocks of goats in this valley there, and there's Ben-Hadad and all of Syria kind of laughing like, man, we're going to stomp on those little goats like you wouldn't imagine. I mean, just two little flocks. There they are in the valley. Their God isn't going to do anything for them. I mean, they could really run and trample all of them. I mean, that is the difference in odds. But notice this, God had already said, you know what he already told them? Through Ahab, the victory has been accomplished. Do you know all they had to do? It was enjoy the victory. They did. They didn't have to win the victory. God already did that. God already won the victory. Do you know why oftentimes we live in defeat and discouragement? Because we refuse to embrace that God's already won the victory. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Paul tells us in the book of Ephesians, as we go out there and we put on this battle, we're in this fight in our Christian life, but the truth is the victory's already been won. He wants us to enjoy that victory, and truthfully, there's no human way. Exactly. In 1 Kings 20, there was no human way. It was impossible. In 1 Kings 18, it was impossible, but 2 Corinthians 12, remember what Paul said? Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then he is strong. So it would have been easy. If there were 130,000 Israelites and 130,000 Syrians, and then Israel gets the battle, Israel walks away thinking, yeah, we were just a little smarter than they were. We were a little more strategic than they were. You can't make these odds up. No one's going to put money on Israel's army here. No one's going to put money on Ahab and be like, oh yeah, Ahab's going to win. It would be a foolish thing to do that. And yet they do win. Why? Because that's the way God operates. Just look to the Bible. David and Goliath. Who should have won? Goliath. But David did. Gideon and the Midianites. Who should have won? Well, the Midianites. But Gideon did. Noah is there against the entire world, and the entire world should have won. Like, hey, we're doing it our way. And God said, no, I'm going to save Noah and his wife. 3 sons and their wives. And today, here's our mindset. Who are we? I mean, here we are on a Sunday night, this small group of believers at a local church in Raymore, Missouri. I mean, what are the odds, right? We step out in the world tomorrow, and the culture of media and entertainment and wickedness and worldliness, there's no way we can win. Can I challenge you, don't limit God? Because the reality is we've already won. The victory's already been won. And so, as believers, we get these opportunities to pray for a lost loved one. And in our minds, it doesn't make sense. And we think, I don't know, boy, that person's wicked. That boss that I work under is corrupt and wicked. And you know what? I kind of deserve for God to save me. But no, listen, folks, none of us deserve that. And God He likes the hard cases. He enjoys that. Revival. I know the folks today that say, well, we're living in the last days and that just isn't going to happen. You know, I've refused to believe that. I really refuse to believe that. Because in essence, what we do is throw in the towel. Well, it really doesn't matter. God can't work the way that he used to. And God can't send revivals the way that he used to. And God can't save sinners the way that he used to. And if we're in our speech, we may not say that, but in our thinking, we do. So why still have a set aside time for revival meetings? Why still have time? And you know what we do? Over the years, we've just gotten shorter and shorter and limited more and limited more. And sadly, I think we ought to be going the other direction. I really do. I know you might have looked at the church calendar this year and thought 10 days. Yeah. I think we ought to go back to the days of 2 weeks. And why? It just gives God time to work and to move. And what about a personal trial that we're facing? And we've given up hope. We say we trust God, but it's in our mind it doesn't make sense. And so here's a question tonight. In that area, whether it's in relation to you or somebody that you love or maybe just somebody that you've prayed for, have you limited God in your life? Have you tried to do things your way? See, 1 Kings 20 doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into our thinking. We don't understand it. Number one, the odds aren't good. The king that God uses is wicked. And yet the victory is still won. Because he's not limited by a person. He's not limited by a place. And he's not limited by probability. And so don't limit God. You know what he wants us to do? You know what he wanted Ahab to do? He wanted Ahab to say, all right, Ben-Hadad just came with this news and Lord, I don't know what to do and I need your help. And God would have been like, I'm here to help you. I can give you the victory. But even in the midst of that, when Ahab just kind of gave up and gave in, God said, listen, I'm still God and I'm still going to get the victory. And God chose to do, chooses to do it different ways. But in any situation, whether he uses Ahab, whether he uses an Elijah on Mount Carmel, whatever the case, know this, God always does what's best. Always. He always does what's best because he's God. So I want to close with this tonight. I've shared this book. I encourage you. It's Daring Dependence. And I was planning on preaching this tonight. And last night we sat down as a family after dinner and we read this story. It's about missionaries. Some of you would know of. Some you've never heard of. And I like that because it's those ones that you never heard of. You know, there's great eternal rewards for them. And this is a missionary. His name was John Williams. Anyone ever heard that? Not the composer, the missionary. John Williams. He was a missionary to Oceania from 1796 to 1839. Was anyone living during that? No, okay. All right. It was entitled, I don't read the whole thing. I was just going to read a portion of it, but I think we'll be done in enough time here. He said this, there are two little words in our language which I have always admired, try and trust. John Williams, missionary to Oceania. I need a boat, said 22-year-old John Williams in 1817. Less than a year before, John Williams and his wife Mary had arrived in the South Pacific. They made their new home on the island of Raiatea, just west of Tahiti, but already Williams eyed the neighboring island of Taha, where people had never heard the gospel. God had gifted this Welshman with the ability to watch and learn, especially with mechanical things. As a youth in England, he had spent weeks observing the machinist in a shop where he managed the business. Just by watching, he learned to do the intricate work himself. Aboard the ship from England, through Rio de Janeiro and Sydney to Tahiti, Williams had observed every aspect of the ship, how it worked and how to sail it. Now, with the need for a boat, Williams tried to build his own. Soon, he sailed to Taha in a handmade 16-foot vessel. Though he loved to work with his hands, Williams' true passion lay elsewhere. He had one goal. He said this, my work is his delight. My work is my delight. In it, I desire to spend and to be spent. I think and hope that I have no other desire in my soul than to be the means of winning sinners for Christ. My anxiety is that my tongue may be ever engaged in proclaiming this salvation and that my words and actions may always be pointing to the cross. Well, that's a good goal, isn't it? William sought to preach Christ crucified. Everything else was a means to an end. In late 1823, Williams wrote to the London Missionary Society he needed a bigger ship to take the gospel to the scattered islands beyond the reach of his homemade boat. For my own part, I cannot content myself within the narrow limits of a single reef, he wrote. And if means are not afforded, a continent would to me be infinitely preferable, for there, if you cannot ride, you can walk. However, the London Missionary Society was not ready to commission another ship. The Duff, which had brought Henry Nott and the first generation of London Missionary Society missionaries to the South Pacific, had been captured by pirates in 1799 and lost forever to the mission. Undaunted, Williams boarded whatever merchant ship would take him where he needed to go, even if it meant inconvenience and lengthy days. Earlier that year, he had left the island cluster around Rete for Aituka in the Cook Islands, over 500 miles away between Tahiti and Samoa. When he left there, 2 Polynesian believers he had trained for gospel ministry stayed behind. Later, in the year aboard a merchant vessel, Williams discovered Rarotonga, an island that would serve as a major launch point for the gospel. After 18 months, Williams returned to Aitaki. He found that God had greatly used the Polynesian believers he had left behind. The islanders had forsaken idolatry, left cannibalism, and built a large church building. Echoing the well-known motto of Carey, Williams wrote, "I hope for great things, pray for great things, and confidently expect great things to result from these labors. If only he had his own ship, so he could scatter dedicated Polynesian evangelists across the South Pacific." 3 years later, Williams had not given up his pleas to the London Missionary Society for a ship. "Had I a ship at my command, not one island in the Pacific, but should, God permitting, be visited and teachers sent to direct the wandering feet of the heathen to happiness to heaven." Finally, in 1827, with the help of his Polynesian brothers in Christ, Williams built his own ocean-worthy ship, the 70-ton, 60-foot vessel, the Messenger of Peace. With the ship at his disposal, Williams' ministry finally transitioned from evangelism and leadership training on one island to making first gospel contact on island after island. Though Williams' imposing height could intimidate the islanders, he attracted them with his friendly demeanor. Williams would often say, "Kindness is the key to the human heart." Islands and hearts opened at his caring efforts. 2 by 2, Polynesian gospel workers followed in Williams' wake. Williams encouraged the Polynesian ministers he left on the islands as missionaries. Work well, pray much, think of the death of Jesus, and reflect that the natives of the islands to which you go are purchased with his blood. The unsaved residents of these islands will watch you with rat's eyes to find little crooked places in your conduct. Therefore, these native missionaries must remember well your work. Give it to your hands, your mouth, your body, your souls, and God bless your labors. In your temporal concerns, be diligent. A lazy missionary is both an ugly and a useless being. He exhorted them, have singleness of heart to Jesus and his gospel. Search his word and pray to him. For over a decade, Williams advanced the gospel from island to island in Polynesia. In 1839, Williams initiated contact in Vanuatu, then called New Hebrides. The locals, having been recently attacked and abused by depraved European traders, took out the revenge on the Welsh missionary who had come to bring God's love. Despite William's martyrdom, God continued to work. 19 years later, John Paton would arrive in Vanuatu and establish churches across these islands, bearing the fruit that Williams had died to plant. Throughout his ministry, Williams encouraged his fellow missionaries, whether foreign or Polynesian, to launch out and attempt great things for God. There are 2 little words in our language which I have always admired: try and trust. You know not what you can or cannot effect until you try. And if you make your trials in the exercise of trust in God, mountains of imaginary difficulty will vanish as you approach them, and facilities will be afforded which you never anticipated. Williams spoke from personal experience. He launched out and attempted much for God while depending on God to open doors of opportunity for the gospel. In Matthew 14, Jesus called Peter to step out of the boat in the middle of a storm, to walk on water as Jesus did. Peter tried what 11 other disciples did not dare attempt, and he did what none of them ever did. Peter walked on water. Jesus calls every follower today to step out and rely on him, to try and trust. Do you dare depend on him like John Williams did? Do not allow obstacles to freeze you to inaction. If you try, you may fail, but you may also succeed. Alternatively, you may discover a path towards God's goals for your life that you would never have otherwise found had you not stepped out. You may find out that the barrier you perceived to be insurmountable was not nearly the roadblock you thought it to be. You may discover that the greatest impediment is your own fearful imagination. However, if you do not try, you're guaranteed to fail, and you will lose the opportunity to learn greater dependence on God. Like John Williams, let us try and trust. I thought that was interesting as I looked to preach this tonight on limiting God. I'm thankful that there have been men and women that determined it may not make human sense, but we're going to trust God and we're going to just try. And I'd encourage us here tonight, don't be a people that limits God. He's not limited by a place, a person, or a probability. He still is able to do exceeding great and mighty things. And he truly wants us to trust him. He desires that we would, and maybe this week there'll be an opportunity for us to exercise that faith that so pleases him. It's the only way to please God. But oftentimes it's hindered, maybe because of discouragement, maybe because of a lack of faith. But tonight, like John Williams, even like an Ahab, if we will allow God to use us, God desires to do just that. Let's not limit God. Father, I pray that you'd help us to be a people that truly trust you. I'm sure there's folks here tonight that something came to mind. It's a wall that seems insurmountable. It's a difficulty or a discouragement that seems, I don't know if there's a way out. Maybe in the valley, in that cave, we feel as if we have been left alone to try to figure it out in our own strength. And yet we can read in your word, and we can read, as we did tonight, of missionaries that just determined it might not make human sense, but we're gonna trust God, and we're going to try anyway. And I was mentioning to our children last night that there was a young man in our youth group that went to the island of Vanuatu as a missionary. And that's largely because years ago of what John Williams and then John Patton would do. And so I pray that you would help us to believe you like that, to trust you when it doesn't make sense. And tonight, maybe there's a burden that we could just cast on you and say, Lord, I don't want to fret about it. Don't want to worry about it. I want to trust you. Maybe it's an opportunity that we have, and maybe it doesn't make human sense, but you've convinced us and burdened us that it's the right decision. And may we trust you in faith to take that step of faith, whatever that is. With heads bowed, eyes closed tonight. I know on Sunday nights we don't always give an invitation, but could I ask, how many would say tonight, something came to my mind, someone, something came to my mind. Humanly speaking, it does seem impossible. But I'm sure thankful tonight I serve the God of the impossible. He's not limited. And tonight, I want to exercise my faith by saying, I don't want to limit him in that area in my life. Would you just slip your hand up tonight? Something came to your mind, an area, something. Amen. So tonight, would you tell him that? He knows what it is already. Matter of fact, he already knows the victory. He's been there. He's won it. He wants you to enjoy it. And tonight, maybe just in dependence upon him, as John Williams did. Lord, I'm just going to trust you, and I'm going to take whatever that next step is. Would you just quietly stand to your feet tonight, and as the piano plays,